the last 8 days in the Peck household has been very full, to say the least. The first 4 of those 8 days were spent in Ohio at Burgess's grandma's, going there for Burgess's grandma's funeral, which is really weird for me. I don't know if weird is the right word, but none of my grandparents are alive, and they all died when I was in my teens, maybe my early, and then 20s. There was one holdout, my mom's dad. But, because I was in my teens and 20s, it didn't really affect me. I mean, it affected me, but not now with having kids and being in my 40s and having a much bigger, fuller view on life. And like when I was looking, her grandma was cremated. When I was looking at the urn, I'm like, and Burgess's grandma's name was Tib. And I kept just thinking, like, Tib's in there. Like, Tib's in that jar. She's inside there. And I wanted to turn and talk to her. Like, literally at the funeral home, I wanted to turn and talk to Tib and say, can you believe you're in there? And just like how the brain has to manage or contemplate or figure out, like, oh, this woman is dead. And I only knew her for 12 years. But she made a big impact on my life. And I think because as an adult, she still felt like my grandma, even though she was my wife's grandma. But she was a very important person for Burgess because she played the role of her parents. And so as we came home from that trip, and it sounds weird for me to say this, but it was actually a fun trip. We all, the 4 of us, shared one hotel room, which had never turned out that well in the past. But this time it turned out really well. And my little 4-year-old, bless her heart, she was telling Burgess, she said, Mom, I want to move to Ohio. And Burgess is like, why? And she goes, because we get to sleep in the same room. I just love how the 4-year-old brain can like think about, well, to Ohio to her is we get to all sleep in the same bedroom for 4 days. And then we came home, and then we have a Thanksgiving week, and Thanksgiving was yesterday at our house, and including our family, just the 4 of us, we had 13 people at our house, and it was great. I felt like I was just shoving food down my throat. I'm like, okay, it's Thanksgiving, just do it. But we had some good friends over, and it was just nice, as much as it could be nice, because we were the host, and it's a lot of work. And after they left, and I don't mind cleaning. Actually, it's kind of meditative to me, but I spent about two and a half hours cleaning the kitchen. So with that, I want to thank everyone who listens to me and who sends me emails and who says, please, RC, please keep doing your weekend emails and podcasts. Some are members, some are not members. And it's nice just hearing from you. So if there's something I say that strikes a chord with you or that resonates with you, I love hearing from that, because I am sitting in my office talking to myself right now, looking at my computer screen, though I know thousands of people listen to this, and I want to thank you for that. So thank you. Everybody, this is my weekend podcast, and let's call it the Thanksgiving weekend podcast. And the theme for this weekend is 2 things. Thing 1 and thing 2. I have 2 things I want to share with you. One looks, I'll call it positive. One is a positive looking price chart, and one is a potential negative looking price chart. And so with that, let's jump in and look at the 2 price charts, or the 2 images that I want to share with you this Thanksgiving weekend here in the U.S. And even though, and I have a lot of viewers, watchers, followers in my world outside the United States, my thanks goes out to you too. The first price chart I want to show you is an inflation-adjusted S&P 500 chart. And this chart is 20 years. It shows 20 years of data. And as you can see from the top horizontal line, we are at the exact same point, or we were back in August, the exact same point where the S&P 500 was back in the year 2000. And I find this amazing. I mean, it's not amazing, but to be able to look at this and say, okay, this is inflation adjusted, and this is The inflation number I'm using is the Bureau of Labor Statistics inflation number. And if you followed me for any amount of time or ever watched me when I was on TV a lot, I would call the Bureau of Labor Statistics the Ministry of Truth because that's kind of what it feels like, what they say is true. And I have a lot of issues with how they manage and come up with their inflation number. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, they change the way they measure inflation every, decade or decade and a half. So, but I'm using theirs, and I actually do think it's more of a conservative number. But with that, we are right back to where we were in the year 2000. Now, in the year 2000, the price to earnings ratio, what people were willing to pay for $1 of lifetime annual income, people are paying $45. They're literally paying $45 for $1 of lifetime annual income. And today they're paying about $22. So in the matter of 15 years, we're right back to where we were in the year 2000 based on the inflation-adjusted S&P 500 chart. This is amazing, right? But now people are only paying $22 for $1 of lifetime annual income. And as you know, back in November of 2000, I said we entered into what I call a physical cycle or a contracting cycle. And that's a cycle where the price to earnings ratio of the S&P 500 continues to contract in size over the next, on average, 18 years. And here we are 15 years in, even though the price of the S&P 500 has gone up. Now, you don't see it on this price chart because this is inflation adjusted, but it has gone up, but it is still contracting. And I've also said that these 18-year periods, it doesn't have to be 18 years. It could be longer. It could be shorter. That historically, the price to earnings contractingness stops when the PE ratio gets to single digits. And we have not gotten to single digits. We got close in March of 2009, depending on how you measure the price to earnings ratio. But we got close to it, but we didn't really get to it. And so that's why I continue to say that we are in a contracting period or a physical cycle period, even though gold and silver have been falling for 4.5 years. And unfortunately, they still have the path of least resistance for gold and silver is still down right now. And I have every intent to move back into those markets when the path of least resistance is not down, but right now we are just stepping aside. So from the two things I want to share with you this Thanksgiving weekend, one is a S&P 500 price chart, inflation adjusted. It has to break above this, of course, to move higher. And if it does, or when it does, it will one day, whether it's in the next 2 months or the next 20 years, of course it will. I think it's going to move up much higher. It will not be the beginning of a 18-year bull market cycle in the price. No, we still have one more major correction to go to contract that price to earnings ratio down to some sort of single-digit number. For reference, back in 1982, the price to earnings ratio bottomed at 6, just to give you reference. So we have to break above this support, this resistance line. I called it a support. It's a resistance line. We have to break above that. The S&P 500 has to break above that. And if it does, it's very likely we could get a 20, 30, maybe even a 40% more run in the S&P, which I know sounds ridiculous and would anger a lot of people because of the money printing and companies buying back their shares because of cheap debt. But something in motion stays in motion until something of equal and opposite force pushes back against it. And the first big one right now is this inflation-adjusted S&P 500 chart. So we'll see what happens as the price moves forward. The second and last price chart I want to show you is U.S. housing prices. Now, this only goes back 15 or 16 years. And it peaked at the very beginning of 2006 at about $206,000. And where we are today is about $180,000. So from a percentage point, housing could move up about another 15% to get back to the 2006 high. And prices going back to major turning points, whether that's a bottom turning point or a topping turning point. And so it's very likely we could see another 15% nationwide of housing appreciation. Now, if you're in Europe, it's different. If you're in Canada, it's different. If you're in other countries, it's different. But as far as the US, with about 330 million people, largest economic population in a single country on the planet, the US still represents about 25% of the world gross domestic product. So what does happen here does affect other parts of the world. And if housing did go up another 15%, that is the biggest part of someone's net worth nationwide, is the value of their house. So that will have people feel richer if their house appreciates, even if they do not pull out money. And it's my guess that people will not go crazy this time around and start pulling out second mortgages, home equity line of credits, but they will still be mending their balance sheet. The one thing that's not in here that I'll just quickly say about housing is housing does go up over time much slower than you think. If you go back and look at these kind of 20-year segments of time, it's basically inflation is what housing moves at, whatever local inflation you're at. So I'm talking to you from Silicon Valley, and inflation in Silicon Valley is about 5%. So that's historically what you've seen housing increase at. If you're in another part of the country, in Wyoming or San Diego or South Dakota or South Bend, it's going to go up at your local inflation. So historically, real estate has moved up over inflation. Now, what's interesting about that is over that time period, square footage of housing has also increased. So I've never done the economics on what is the actual square foot increase of housing, and I'm willing to bet it's actually negative. Hear me out, because in 1970 in the United States, the average sized house was 1,400 square feet. And today, 35 years later, the average size house is 2,800 square feet. So if someone wants to go do this work, I'd love to see it. What has inflation been per square foot of U.S. housing? And I'm willing to bet it's flat or actually negative. But one of the big parts that has increased the price of housing over the last, in this case, 35 years, is that houses are actually getting bigger. So people are paying more for that. So what's the takeaway? Well, the first takeaway is inflation is invisible and inflation matters. And we can't see it. Most charts you look at, most price charts, in fact, almost all the price charts you look at, or information or numbers you study or I study or anyone studies, is without inflation. And yet when I talk to people, when I have new clients come to me and say, RC, please come into my life and help me, one of the things we look at, especially when they're in their 60s or 70s or even 80s, yes, I have clients in my 80s. I have clients in their 80s, not in my 80s. Hopefully I'll have clients when I'm in my 80s. But one thing is, I have the money, but will I run out of it? What about purchasing power? And if you're over 60, the main thing people worry about is healthcare and health. And inflation, inflationary rates around healthcare is much different than inflationary rates around food or inflationary rates around education, though higher education is very expensive in this country. So inflation matters and it's invisible. The other takeaway is, which I maybe touched on it subtly, but prices can move up much higher than we could ever imagine emotionally, and they can move much lower than we could ever imagine emotionally or visually. And that's why what's most important is to study price. Because at the end of the day, price determines what your portfolio goes up or doesn't go up. So with that, guys, thank you so much for being in my world. This is just another step in helping you protect and grow your portfolio and your future. Until next time, this is RC Peck. Hey, everybody, thanks so much for being in my world. I am thankful for the world that I've created and continue to create for you to help you make better choices, smarter choices. And one of the things I've noticed over the last 18 years of working with people and their money is having those conversations, being able to have a conversation with an outside source who is unbiasedly looking at your money, looking at your investments, and giving you that kind of the direct feedback, the feedback that you probably know you should have, and maybe actually a little painful. But when you look back on it a month later, 2 months later, or 3 months later, you go, wow, that's the conversation. That's the point of view that I've needed for years. And one of the things that you may want to think about, or that you have been thinking about, is even just getting a conversation with me so we could have a portfolio review to get that outside point of view, that third party point of view. And if you do, the next step is super easy. You just reach out to Patty and set that up. Patty is Patty at Fearless Wealth. You guys take care of yourself, and I look forward to having, what do we have, 3 more, 4 more, 5 more of these weekend podcasts until 2016 starts. Oh my gosh, crazy. Okay, speak to you then.